I'm Deborah Saxton, project manager for Shaw. We wanted to take this opportunity this evening to inform you of an impending change with Shaw. The Shaw Group, which Shaw E&I is a wholly owned subsidiary of, will be acquired by CB&I. CB&I is an engineering and construction company that focuses on the energy industry. You may or may not have heard of this. This was first announced back in July 2012, and we're expecting the transaction to occur on February 13th of this year, coming up next week. The important thing to note is that this transaction will in no way affect the Shaw team that's been working on this project or the services that we provide. The main difference you will see is the CB&I logo will replace the logo you've been accustomed to seeing, and really that's the only change you'll notice. Directive 4 of Amendment 4 requires Texas Brine Company to take over the operation and maintenance of the observation relief wells 1 through 4. Important to note here, this does not mean we won't be involved with the, we will be doing oversight of this work. That doesn't change. We'll still continue to evaluate the data from these wells and determining the effectiveness of the reduction of the methane in the aquifer. ORW3, which is on the Trish property, will not be included at this time. The Texas Brine does not have landowner access. Tonight we're going to give you an update on the current progress on 3 main items: reducing the methane in the Mississippi River alluvial aquifer, the active 3D seismic, the main things are reducing the methane in the aquifer, the active 3D seismic activity that's currently taking place, and the stability of the western side of the salt dome and the adjacent caverns. You'll hear from Dr. Gary Hecox and Dr. Will Pettit, which you've heard from previously. Tonight, I'd like to introduce a new member of the Shaw team, Don Moreland. You can come on up, Don. Speaking up. Don is a petroleum geophysicist, and he will be performing an independent evaluation of this active 3D seismic data. So I'll turn it over to Don.
Hi y'all, my name is Don Marlin. Hope everybody can hear me all right here. So I'm first want to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to come down and talk to y'all tonight. My background, just to introduce myself, I was hired through Shaw to work for the state of Louisiana as a consultant, petroleum geologist and petroleum geophysicist. And my background education comes from LSU in Baton Rouge. I was there, lived in Baton Rouge there 79 through about 1990. And basically my role on this is to do an independent review of the 3D data set that's actually going to be shot out here. I've got about 30 years experience here in the Gulf Coast. It's not from anywhere else around the world. I focused on the Gulf Coast. And I've authored some good papers on surface and subsurface geology, on 3D reconnaissance for groundwater and environmental reconnaissance, and even on 3D seismic applications as far as seismic project management for 3D. I work for a bunch of companies, a lot of oil and gas exploration companies across the coast, Gulf Coast. State, university, landowners, and individuals basically give them an opinion as to what's going on underneath their feet. Most importantly, I've been involved with the design and the acquisition and the processing and, most importantly, the interpretation of this 3D seismic data. And that's for both two-dimensional and three-dimensional seismic surveys. And I mention that primarily because in the 80s we had, in order for us to find oil and gas and identify the subsurface, we used subsurface control, which is all well bores, and 2D seismic, and that's just going to give you a slice of the earth. But it wasn't until about 1992 when one of my clients got a chance to purchase a field that had the first onshore independent 3D seismic survey that I was able to work with that. And that's when things started to change. So I've worked on a good handful of these things across the Gulf Coast, and it resulted in a lot of successes. So hopefully I'm going to bring this to the table so you can understand the subsurface around this area that we're talking about today. Just to give you a quick little overview of where I've been working in the Gulf Coast, those little patches up there represent 3D seismic that I've been involved in since 1992. Prior to that, in the, again, 1980s, all we had was subsurface and 2D to work with as far as independent oil and gas companies. Some of the majors had some activities going onshore for 3D before that, but it wasn't until early 90s to mid-90s when it became a very commercially viable tool to be used. And I'll kind of put it in this perspective, is that in the 80s we were batting 100 to 300. Every 1 out of 10 wells to 3 out of 10 wells we drilled, we were able to identify the targets in the ground with accuracy. In the 90s, when we had 3D seismic, I've been involved with programs that were batting 800 and 1,000. So that shows you the benefit of the 3D. So hopefully this will give you a really good understanding that 3D is a really good tool to have up front to understand the changes that are going on in the subsurface around the Bayou Corn area. And where it's associated on the Gulf Coast is, well, you know where we are, so we'll just move on to the next slide then, Gary. One of the first things I was told that I should do, and I even brought forth that I needed to do here, was to understand what's present, what the subsurface looked like before the sinkhole occurred. And that's something that, in order to put together a picture like that, you've got to tie together all of the old well control, all the old well records, all of the subsurface records that you can get your hands on through the State Department and private libraries and also proprietary resources, and put together a picture of the subsurface. And what this diagram represents, I'll kind of put my pointer on where the sinkhole is located right there. This represents clouds of areas that show where the activity was over the last 70 to 80 years. Inside the yellow area, that's where wells were drilled along the west flank of the Napoleonville Salt Dome between 1930 and 1960. And they were just poking around trying to find out what the sediments looked like at that time, with primarily well control, maybe even gravity data, and maybe even old two-dimensional seismic data. There was a hiatus between 1960 and 1970 in that there wasn't any drilling done on that during that phase, but in 1975 and in 1976-82, that's when Dynamic drilled a well, the company out of Lafayette, and then the first salt caverns were drilled over on this area. The red circle represents where there was drilling activity along the flank of the dome in the mid-80s. So you can see there's a little hiatus between 75 or so until 1985, where there wasn't any drilling activity until Celeron, Republic, and Adams Resources drilled a well, and they encroached closer to the salt dome edge looking for oil and gas that was trapped next to the salt. In 1986, that well actually found oil and gas. I think Kevin Hill spoke about this before, but primarily they drilled a well down to about 6,500 feet. They found oil and gas at 6,100. Logged that. They found oil and gas pay on that log, cased that well, and then they produced that well for about 15 years until 2001 when they plugged it. Right after they plugged that well, Mid-America came up here in 2000 and 2002 and drilled 2 wells on the north part of the sinkhole. And that's what that purple cloud represents. And the important part of this is I'm just trying to put together a picture to illustrate, this is what I studied to put together a subsurface interpretation pre-sinkhole. So if you go on to the next, all of these points of control help me understand the stratigraphy underneath the ground, what the layers of the rock look like. Sandstones, shales, limestones, where oil and gas could be found on these wells. And it also gives us a perspective of what the subsurface geology looks like outside of the flank of the salt dome. So this is how I would actually look at the data before we had 3D seismic. If we look at a detail of this, go to the next slide. This is one of several cross sections that I built in the area, and it's the scale on the horizontal side is not 2 scale, but the vertical scale is correct, it's about 1 into 100. But what this really shows to you is the things that we study. We study where these layers of shale, layers of sandstone, layers of carbonate actually terminate up against the salt wall. You go to the next one. This is a little deeper in the cross section. This is where that Adams Resources well was drilled down to about 6,300 feet, and they found oil and gas in what locally they call the M&N sands. And I know we refer to them as Big Hum. Big Hum is just a paleo marker. It's a little bug that we identified in the rock record. But locally they sometimes call these things by alphanumeric zones. And for this particular well, they call that 6,200 Reservoir A sand unit A. There was a unit that was adopted back in 1986 for that well. The long and short of this is that you take the old well control and you take whatever information that you have in the past and tie it together with 3D seismic. And I had a chance, if you go to the next step, I have a chance to actually look at and interpret the 2007 3D data set that was acquired by Legend Petroleum, and that we have a small subset. Small subset meaning that we have about 0.4, maybe 0.35 square miles of data, just a little tiny piece of a 50 square mile project. Well, when you integrate the well control that was drilled between 1930 and 2002 with this 2007 3D seismic data set, you get a three-dimensional picture of what the area looks like before the sinkhole was found. And the importance of this is that the data that we're shooting today, the 2013 active seismic data, active meaning that humans are actually creating the sound waves into the ground to create this 3D seismic picture versus passive where the earth makes a sound. This gives you the picture of what it looks like beforehand. And what this illustrates is we've got some black and red pins out here, which are the old wells that were drilled between 1930 and 2000. You've got some orange pins out here, which are the locations of the actual salt dome caverns. The light blue represents an interpretation of where the salt wall, or the interface of the salt dome, sits versus exterior to the salt dome, where you have layers of competent shale and sands that you can interpret that terminate up against the salt. You also illustrate, and what I can see in the subsurface, that you have some faulting that has been present there since the time the salt was actually moving, which is quite a long time ago. And what that all illustrates is the relationship of the subsurface versus where the sinkhole is currently today. So I think this is important because if we know what happened beforehand, we can tie it together with what we had afterwards, we'll know what the actual changes are in the subsurface using this new 3D data set that's being shot today, or in the next